Good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, wherever you are. So welcome to Tuesday's live editing session. Hello all of you. Where are you all at? Norway, Spain, Amsterdam, Germany. Bruce is Bruce in? No, Jerry is. Jerry's still online in Arizona. Sunny, warm, and spiking in Arizona. Okay, cool. So first off, let's get me on the screen. Hello. So I'm gonna say hello this session. Last time we had a little bit of weirdness with the voice and my mouth. So either I've got a really cool ability to speak faster than the sound comes out, or there's something a bit weird. But we'll have a look at that. Bruce is online. Good morning, Bruce, as well. Um, so. Um, who else we got? Jeff's online from Canada. Jeff, I didn't know you were in Canada. Cool. Okay. Well, we got what else? Switzerland, Cape Town. Some of you over in Asia. Okay, cool. Let's get going with today's session then. We've got quite a few to get through today. Reminders for everyone. So those of you that haven't been online with this before, bear in mind the comments that you put up on the screen take a little while to get through to me. They take about 15 seconds. That's the way that restreaming works, unfortunately. So bear that in mind. I'm not ignoring you if you put a comment through. It's just that it takes a while for me to see it on the screen. It might not be the right time to interrupt what we're editing, but we'll try and get through as many of those comments and questions as we can. So the version of Capture One that we are using today is still version 13.1.1 if you're a techie coder, or version 20.1.1 if you're a marketing lovey. Obviously, Capture One changed when they went from version 12 to version 20. They skipped quite a few, and the idea is the versions will stick with the year. Obviously, we're in 2020 right now. So make sure you're up to date. If you are not up to date or you don't have Capture One, you're just using this to have a look at what it can do, then make sure you download either the upgrade. So if you've already got version 20 and you don't have the latest service release, make sure you go to captureone.com and get it. If you don't have version 20 and you want to give it a try, then do the free trial. I think it's 30 days, completely free, completely open. There's no watermarking or any silliness like that, so you can have a play down to your heart's content. And if you already have an older version of Capture One, then obviously there's a discounted rate for upgrading. Or if you're on the subscription model, then you get it free anyway, or you get it included in that subscription. So we've got loads of you joined. Cool. So we've got loads of you in the UK today. It's kind of weird. So it's really hot still in the UK, but hopefully tomorrow this big rainstorm's going to fix everything. Right, let's go into Capture One. So as you can see, we're going to start off with some more Milky Way shots, to the point where so many of you have sent in Milky Way shots. We're going to do a couple more today, just to try and get some of the techniques sort of honed in. But we're also going to release this as one of the pro tip sessions on YouTube. So don't forget that you can go to the YouTube channel and there's all the preset things on. There's one on clarity, there's one on exposure, there's one on dehazing. There will be one on Milky Way editing, because it seems to be a very popular question of how to get the best out of it in Capture One. So let's start with this one from Miguel, and let's just do effectively a standard Milky Way edit. So there is a sort of a recipe to the Milky Way stuff. We covered it before, but we'll go through it again here. And a lot of it comes down to how you interpret the histogram. So just like any image, we're going to first off start in our lens corrections. It was shot at 2.8. We get that information down here on the bottom. So all of your images, you should have the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture down here. If for whatever reason you don't, just by the way, because someone asked me this question the other day, if you go to your view menu and under customize viewer, you'll see one that says labels. If that's not ticked, you won't see this information. So if that's missing, and the same up here for the browser labels. So if it's missing, just make sure you've gone into customize viewer and make sure you've got labels enabled, and you'll see the name of the file as well as all the information about it. Okay, so let's have a little play with our lens settings. So we've got the lens profile loaded in. It's one of the popular lenses from Nikon, so obviously the profile's in Capture One. We can do a direct analyzing of chromatic aberration on there, which will hopefully shore it up a little bit more. It's a pretty wide lens at 14 to 24, so there's probably a lot of distortion in there. The distortion slider here, someone actually asked in the Facebook group the other day, why does it sort of go from 0 to 100 and generally people don't use it much in between? If you're on an ultra wide lens, you get barrel distortion effectively. You get the edges start to warp, especially if you're shooting architecture or something with very clear straight lines. When you do that, and you're using an ultra wide lens without distortion correction, those lines will bend at the edges. It's very rare to find an ultra wide lens that doesn't have any bend in it at all. The distortion correction in Capture One, you can actually see the things moving around the grid as I move the slider. The distortion correction will fix that to as straight as it can get. Now, if you're shooting a landscape and you don't want to lose anything, because of course one of the ways it's doing that is by cropping, essentially. If you don't want to lose any information on the sides, don't use distortion correction, but accept that you're going to have a little bit of curvature when it gets to the end of the lenses. Once you get above the natural lens for your sensor, so effectively 35 millimeters on a 35 millimeter equivalent or 50 millimeters on a full frame medium format equivalent, once you get to that level, typically distortion correction is not going to do you many favors. It's not really going to do much. So quite often when you load in the lens profile, what you'll see is Capture One has set this down at 0. For this lens, its default is 100, but for a lot of lenses, it's at 0. In which case, leave it where it is. Unless you're noticing some distortion in the shot, don't worry about having to use that. Okay, so we've got our shot overall. Let's have a little quick look, and obviously there's the first thing we want to check is there any fringing or anything like that in the high contrast points? It's difficult on a Milky Way one because those high contrast points are unfortunately going to be very, very rare to find because it's actually between the star and the foreground that's in shadow. I think, is that a tent? I think that's a tent there. Miguel, I don't know if that's your tent, but it's certainly someone camping up there on this hill with the Milky Way. It's a cool shot of the Milky Way. So with no purple fringing to worry about, I'm not worried about diffraction because we're at 2.8. I'm not too worried about sharpness fall off because actually it's probably, yeah, we're focused out at infinity. It's going to be pretty sharp, and actually at the edges on a wide lens, over this period of 19 seconds, you're going to see some movement in the stars and stuff like that, which may look like a bit of a blur. If we over sharpen this image, we end up with something called bullet holes, which is where the light point has got a little dark area around it. We don't want that. So if we're typically doing Milky Way work, unless you've got sharpening issue around the edge, then don't worry about it too much. Light fall off, obviously, if you've got a lens that heavily vignettes, then use the light fall off to effectively ease that out, so to get rid of that vignetting and try and flatten up the scene. In this case, it's actually going to be quite handy to us. We've got quite a strong vignette up there, so we're not going to do it up completely, but we'll probably pull it up to about 40 or 50, somewhere around there, just to lighten those corners, just to keep that flat, rather than having a vignette to start with. I'd rather a vignette that we control, not one that's born out of the lens. So we could go to our color tab, but actually most of what we're going to do in our editing is going to be in this one, which is the exposure tab. So this is where we spend most of our time in Capture One. There's not actually that much in terms of noise in this one. The camera's done pretty well. What is it? A D750. Yeah, it's a very good low light camera. So we can see this at ISO 3200. Our level of noise, I'm going to go in unfairly at 200%. It's still pretty clean. Of course, we could do some noise reduction in this, but I wouldn't worry about it too much right now. The amounts that have been dialed in automatically are going to do enough for us. Okay, so in our exposure tab here, this is the standard setup on the left-hand side. Obviously, you can move tools around in Capture One. We can grab all of this stuff for those of you that haven't been in it before. But for those of you that have, you'll probably have your workspace set up a standard way for your way of working. For me, actually, the default way in Capture One works just fine for me. I just ignore some of the tabs most of the time. So let's have a look at the wider image and let's think about what we want to change. Well, first of all, there is a huge amount missing in here, a huge amount of data missing. Now, it's data that's missing to my eyes, but not necessarily to the camera, especially on the camera that was in use. So let's just have a little look at our exposure and pull this up and see what was actually in the picture. Well, that's pretty good. We've got a lot of noise in here for sure, but noise correction is going to fix some of that. We can see it working as we scan around the image. But while we brought this up, obviously this is way too bright now up here in the Milky Way. So we only want to affect the dark areas of the image or the shadows or the blacks part of the histogram. Now, when it comes to working out what we want to edit, this is where people get a bit confused with Milky Way shots. Because the sky here, so the way that Capture One actually separates these things out, you've got 4 different areas in HDR. You've got effectively, you've got the brightest part of the histogram. So the top 4 or 5%, that's our whites on our high dynamic range. So if you look in here, that's the white slider here. Then you've got the darkest parts of the histogram. So the bottom 4 or 5% of the values that come in out of the RGB scale. That's considered the black slider in HDR. Then you've got highlight and shadow. Now, highlights and shadows reflects the top, probably about 20%, 25%, depends on the image, but the top brightness areas of the image for highlights and the bottom darkness areas of the image for the shadows. So highlights and shadows is probably the top 20%, maybe 25, and the bottom 20, 25%. Whites and blacks is the top and bottom 4 to 5%. But whites and blacks are included in those highlights. The highlights aren't included in the whites and blacks. So if I adjust shadows, I'm also adjusting the blacks. If I adjust black on its own, I'm not necessarily adjusting all the shadows. Same with highlights. So if I adjust the highlights, I'm also affecting the white part of the histogram, the brightest part. If I adjust the highlight, also the whites in the scales, I may not be adjusting all of the highlights. So whites doesn't necessarily mean highlights, it's a subset of it. So bearing that in mind, this sky here, and I can use the histogram. You see this orange line that appears on the left of the histogram as I'm moving around. So as I go into the dark areas, look, that's sat here in the blacks area of the slider. When I go up here, this is in the shadows area of the slider. So a lot of people will immediately just try and pull up shadows in a Milky Way shot because we want to bring up the what we see as the shadow, right? The foreground here is in shadow. But shadows isn't what we want to affect here. Here, this is all in the blacks area. So we just need to use that black slider in high dynamic range instead of shadow. If I pull up shadows, yes, it pulls up the foreground, but it also pulls up the sky. We don't want that. It's the night sky. So if I just focus on the black slider, now I'm pulling up the foreground without affecting the sky. The sky is sat, as you can see on that orange line that's moving around on the histogram on the left at the top. The sky is sat very firmly in the shadows, but not in the blacks area. The blacks alone will bring up those darkest parts of the image. Now, this is a bit too much, so I'm going to just pull it down to there. Also, I've got a little bit of a, also we've got a question, where are we? So Damien, whites are, blacks are locked or vary with histogram. So I don't know the exact maths in terms of what percentage it is. I've talked to a couple of people actually about this. About finding out exactly what percentage is. I don't know. In my experience, it tends to be the bottom 4 to 5% and the top 4 to 5%. But it's always, sorry, to answer your question, Damien, specifically, it's not based on the histogram of available data for that image. It's based on the histogram of 0 to 255. I think that was what your question was, actually. So it's not based on, if I loaded in a really dark image, then the whites aren't going to be a darker subset of it. It's still going to be only affecting the bits that are at the 255 end. So I think that's it. I hope that makes sense. So on here, we've just pulled up the black slider, and that's the only change we've made already, and it's already a big difference. So let's now look at the color balance or the white balance of this shot. Especially here, I know this is green grass for sure, but what this isn't is green concrete. That doesn't really make sense. So the green concrete, that's down to the fact that we've got an issue with our white balance, and it's perfectly normal to have a white balance challenge at night because the camera's brain basically gets fried based on all these different impacts that are coming from it. You've got street lights coming into it, which are nice warm yellow and orange. You've got the dark night sky, which is typically quite deep blue and some pink areas and whatever. And in here, you've got the green of the grass if the camera was able to work that out. So we're going to manually change our white balance, and I'm going to make it a bit cooler. And I'm going to switch that tint to go away from the green area in the scale. So in white balance terms, Kelvin goes from cool to warm. So in broad terms, blue to yellow. Blue being very cold light, think moonlight, so on. Then you've got, in the middle of the day, you've got bright daylight, which is sort of neutral at 5500. And then you've got warm light. And warm light is that sort of sunset, sunrise, golden glow. And we can adjust that white balance obviously manually as well as taking a reading directly. To take a reading directly, I'd use this little picker. And before we do that, let's find an area of the image that should be neutral. So it doesn't have to be white or black, it just has to have no color. So it should be on the gray scale. So I'm going to pick on that concrete, maybe this one, don't know. And it's made an approximation, it's guessed at exactly what the white balance should be. It's not far off. Everything I now do with white balance can be my choice, my artistic choice and interpretation of that scene. So to me, the white balance is probably about right, that sort of yellow to blue era. However, tint, I'm going to push it a little bit more pink. So tint goes from green to pink or green to magenta. The reason the tint slider exists is actually nothing to do with digital photography that we do normally without filters. So the problem that you have with using glass filters in front of a camera is typically all substances have some form of color cast when you put light through them. Now, color cast typically goes from green to magenta. So strangely, tint as a slider is there to fix color cast issues. If anyone's ever bought things like Lee filters, are horrendous, or they had been horrendous. They've got a bit better recently, but horrendous for a greeny blue color cast on the big stopper and so on. You'd use the tint slider to pull that away from the green, and you'd neutralize it by pushing it towards the magenta area. Now, this one's probably not been taken with a filter because it was at night. At night, we want as much light as we can get in, but there's still a bit of a tint adjustment that I want to make just to make sure that it feels a little bit more nightimey. But that's purely down to your own interpretation. To a lot of people, nighttime feels a lot warmer. It's up to you. But that's what we're doing with white balance. We're adjusting to make sure that the tones of the neutral parts of the image, like here, are absolutely neutral, and the tones of everything else that's around make sense. So in here, we've got some green grass in here. I'm actually going to desaturate that a little bit anyway. We've got the nice blue night sky, and then we've got some street lights over here. There is a debate as to whether or not you want to darken those down. To me, it's part of it. It's the fact that we've got a building sat looking out over what seems to be a city out in the background. So let's have a think then about these stars. So these stars are quite obviously in the white section of our histogram. Let's just keep zooming in. Let me just get up to a nice high amount, and I'm going to use my little pointer to pick up on here, and it's actually not reading it quite correctly because these are obviously blown out as stars, but it's certainly in the highlights area of the histogram, if not in the whites. So I'm actually going to use my highlights tool and bring them brighter, and the same with whites to bring them brighter. So this is only going to affect things in that top part of the histogram. You see this little dot here, this little spike. That tiny little spike is all of the white elements in that sky. So what we've done is we've effectively enhanced their brightness. So if they were at sort of 210, they're now at 255. I've got some stars that are fully bright and hitting that top end of that histogram. So we're using our high dynamic range tool to bring up the highlights and the whites to make those stars glow a bit stronger, and to pull up the black section of the histogram, not the shadows, because the shadows also is the sky, but the black section to purely pull up this building. And this is where we get a little bit challenging, which is we're going to pull down our shadows, which is our night sky. Now remember, shadows also includes black. So by every bit that I pull down the shadow, I'm then going to pull up the black. So you see why I'd be doing that. I'm pulling down the shadows to darken the sky, but the shadows also affects the blacks. So I'm then going to pull up the black area of the slider to counter that change in shadows so that my foreground ends up in the same place it was before. But what I've done is I've managed to darken the sky. It is possible to do this with luma ranges and with gradient masks. So I can put a gradient mask across here, just turn the mask on so you can see it. So by drawing that across, we've got a soft fall off between the area, which is 100% of the mask down here, 50% in the middle, and then 0% impact on the top. And I could then go into my luma range and say, actually, I only want this mask, even though it's already a gradient, I don't want it to touch any of the sky, only these dark areas in the foreground there. And let's put a nice soft radius on there. Okay, so we've got that there. That looks pretty good. There's a nice mask over the building. And of course, with that mask then, I can pull up our exposure a little bit if I want to. But to me, for night sky or night sky images, typically doing it through the HDR tools tends to give a more natural result. You don't tend to end up with any cutout effect or any weirdness where it almost looks like you've plonked on a building into the background. Using the HDR tools tends to result in a more natural feel. Okay, back to our background layer. Of course, I could do this on a filled layer. We'll do that in a second with another one. But with our background layer now, I'm just going to pump clarity a little bit. Now be careful, don't do this too much. You see here, you get this halo around the top of that building. That gives it away to me that you've used too much clarity. So we've got to be really careful with this. We use a little bit just to bump the contrast in those areas. So the midtones, let's just push them to have a bit more contrast in them. Overall, I'm going to increase our contrast. And I'm going to also bring up a little bit of structure. Be careful with structure in high ISO images because that structure slider is going to sharpen texture and detail, but it's also going to sharpen noise. It's going to make that more apparent. So be very careful with that. So David's just said, is there ever a case for using different tint corrections in parts of an image? Absolutely. So in another one that we did a couple of weeks ago, I think, actually, if you have a look, when was it? The day of, so it was the 18th of May or the 22nd of May, we got one of these sessions where we actually talked through with David Grover the launch of Capture One 20.1 and the update that happened. And in one of those images, we actually used two different white balances for the sky and the ground, including the tint, because it made sense for that picture. So absolutely, you can choose, and let's really go for it in this one. So I'm going to create a new empty layer. Let's create a nice layer over the sky like that. And I'm going to create, let's just call that one sky. Don't worry, Miguel, we're not going to completely trash your image. We can delete these afterwards. We'll call this one foreground, and on this one I'm going to draw another layer there. So on my foreground layer, I could really warm this up like that. And on my sky layer, I could really cool it down like that if I wanted to. Now, you start to end up in this sort of weird place when it comes to whether it's real or not. So be really careful with what you do with that. But yes, absolutely, you can have two completely different tints and white balances on two different layers. And as long as they interact naturally, there's no problem with doing that. But be careful that it does look natural. Don't overcook it. Okay, so we've done our clarity, we've done a structure adjustment. We could play a little bit with levels and curves if we wanted to. So if we wanted to keep the shadows where they were, but maybe we want to pull up some of these mid-tones and highlights, and then actually let's really push up the brightest parts and keep those where they are. The problem with doing this with night shots, as you can see, is you end up with almost a flattened version of it, so a slightly less contrasty version of it. But it can do the trick if you've got a really tricky area with some bright areas in the city in the background. So Miguel's just said you can do what you like. Okay, so but to me, that's probably as natural as we're going to get from this shot. And if you look at the detail that we've got out of this image, so let's go into our... So to do that, just for those of you that, some of you asked that question actually, how do we do that? So if I'm on my zoom tool, which is Z on the keyboard, then obviously I can zoom in and out with the Option key or Alt key, and I can even draw marquees and I can go to that area. However, if I'm on the hand tool, I can double click anywhere in the image and then move it around. And at any point in the image, so even if I'm on the crop tool, for example, if I hold down the space bar on my keyboard, I go back to the hand tool to move things around. So typically I tend to use the hand tool just because it's a nice quick way of moving around the image. But if we look at this picture here, now that it's done all the corrections on it, let's have a look out from before and after. So there's our before and there's our after. It's quite a big difference. It's still using all the data that was there in the camera, so we haven't added anything. We haven't changed anything. We haven't manipulated the night sky or anything like that. So that's really important to keep it natural. Especially, I have to say this with star images, there is nothing more satisfying to someone who's pixel peeping than pointing out that your galaxy is wrong for where you were at the time of year you say you were. And I've seen it on forums so many times where someone has lifted up a galaxy from another shot and put it on there and then claimed it was an original photo. The Astro guys know what they're doing. They're going to see that thing a mile off. So keep it real, keep it natural, but by all means make the feel of the photo more like where you were. And from there before to thereafter, from my perspective, I think that's a big improvement. What we could do as well, if we wanted to, I could put another adjustment layer in. Oops, not over the top of that one. Create a new one. And with that adjustment layer, let's put up our contrast and also a little bit of exposure as well. So you see what I've done there? Effectively, we've made the stars pop even more if I turn that off and on. So this is effectively an overlay layer that we can do at the very end and control the amount of contrast that you want. So Miguel's just asking this one, is it possible to correct the light pollution with the color editor? It's very hard. Yeah, so we talked about that earlier. We've done it in previous ones. Let's just have a little quick look here. So I'm going to create a new layer. We're going to call this one light pollution. And with this layer, I'm going to use the brush tool. So brush is next to the gradient tool in that panel. I'm going to make sure it's a really soft brush, quite a low opacity. different ways of working. Some use opacity, some use flow. We're not getting into that debate. And I'm going to turn the mask on by pressing M on the keyboard so I can see what I'm doing. And we're just going to paint very carefully over the light pollution area. And I'm just going to build up and make sure we're at nearly 100% where the base is, and then softly spread out so it falls off. It's not going to matter too much because we're going to use the color editor to do this. So now I've got a mask with only this area here. Now I'm going to go into the color editor, and with that mask set I'm going to go to advanced, so not the standard color editor because it is quite a few colors that we want to affect, and advanced gives us a massive bonus for doing this. If I use this little dropper and drop it here, this shows me the cone that we're going to affect here. Now I can increase out here its saturation effectively, and I can increase its hue that we're affecting. So now we're affecting not just the bit that I clicked, but everything to the left and right of it in this color wheel. So all the way around to the yellows here. And with that, I can change saturation, number one. Well, that's going to look gray. That looks a bit odd. Let's also include some of this pink up here as well. Okay, I can change our lightness. Don't overdo that either. But more importantly, I can change the hue. So I can go more to a green or more to, like in this case, a less yellow, basically. We're pushing it towards the reds and the pinks area as we use that negative value in hue. So we can do that a little bit. We can pull down our saturation a little bit. We can increase the smoothness of color transition in there. And we can pull down our lightness a little bit. Again, it's all little. So with that on there, let's just turn that off. You see how yellow that is, and then on here. If I wanted to go even further, we could of course do a luma range on that as well. In fact, let's do a different layer. I'm going to call this one luma range. So on here, I'm going to copy the mask, so same mask from light pollution. So that saves me drawing in again. So I've got a luma range layer with a mask already pre-made. And if I go to my luma range here, I want to affect not the really dark areas, only this light pollution area here. Big radius, big fall off, because I want to make sure that it doesn't look too unnatural when we make the change. Okay, that looks about good. Turn my mask off, and with the luma range selected, of course, in my exposure tab, I can then go down and pull our exposure down, pull our contrast down, pull our saturation up a little bit, because as we pull down exposure, typically the colors tend to desaturate, and that doesn't look very nice. It looks a bit murky. And we could also, if we wanted to, change the white balance in this area. So again, there's nothing stopping us doing on a drawn layer as well as a gradient layer, no problem. But that's effectively there where you'd get to by reducing that noise pollution around the back of this building or castle, whatever, or house or whatever it is. The problem that you have, and this is a personal thing then, I prefer it with it, simply because of one reason. The background of this light pollution actually gives me a nice background to this house or the ruins. Once I get rid of that light, it's sort of lost a little bit. The ruins are lost. It's actually a really nice, almost like a rim light on the back of someone's head in the studio. It's a nice way of separating that foreground to background. So yes, I would pull down the warmth of the light pollution by using the color editor. That's what that layer does. You can pull down the brightness of that area as well with a luma range, but I wouldn't. I'd be really careful with this one and leave it how it is. Okay, so very quickly then, let's do the same thing. So this is a shot from Winnie. On the other end, so everything before was underexposed in Miguel's. In Winnie's, we're slightly overexposed, if anything. And we can just do the same thing, but actually we're going to do it a slightly different way with this shot, which is we're going to use our levels. And I'm going to pull in our levels here and here. So what I'm doing effectively is stretching our histogram. You can see the histogram moving along the top. And we're stretching that just to make it compress a little bit, effectively making the brights brighter and the darks darker, just to get a bit more separation where this is quite a highly illuminated frame. Of course, we can use a luma range as well. So let's create a new, I guess we'll go filled layer. So in other words, we're starting off from everything filled. Let's go to luma range, and I'm going to select only the dark part. So tick the display mask so I can see it. I don't want any of the light areas. I just want these dark shadows. Nice soft fall off. Really wide radius so we don't get any hard lines on it. And with that luma range selected, Let's then actually, I'm going to pull down the contrast a little bit, down the saturation a touch as well, and a little bit of brightness. Now, I'm using brightness instead of exposure, and there's a reason. Again, we've got a pro tip thing on this. Winnie's online. Hi, Winnie. There's a reason that we do this with brightness, not exposure. If I use exposure as a slider, I literally slide the entire histogram to the left or to the right. If I use brightness, I squash the histogram to the left or to the right. So if I push it to the left, so in other words, towards the shadows, with brightness, I don't actually push too many of the shadows off the end. I keep the shadows where they are, but I squash down anything that's in the midtones. Same with going the other way. If I use exposure, I can push things over the edge of highlight so it becomes overexposed. If I use the brightness slider, it can then push it more towards the highlights, but not actually push it over the edge. So in this case, I don't want to push any of the shadows off the edge. I don't want to lose them, but I do want to make some more separation in terms of this image here between the foreground and that sky. So in this case, I'm just going to pull brightness down a touch again. So we're not losing any shadow information, but we are pulling down those midtones more into the dark area of the histogram. Then we've got up here with our sky. So this is a good one actually, where the whole image is generally pretty much too much to the green and too much to the yellow end of that the white balance. So this is a really easy one to do, just to pull that down a white balance there and pull this back up a little bit to neutral, just so that it feels a bit more, again, like a night sky. Now, there are different modes and different ideas of what a night sky looks like. To me, what a night sky looks like is different to the next person. Some people think it looks more green, more yellow, more pink, more blue. Some people want it to be completely dark with only the stars showing. Some people love the fact that you've got all this illumination from the stars. This is personal preference. You have to accommodate it. Within your shot. There isn't necessarily a clear recipe that does it for everyone. Okay, so on this one, let's pull in another gradient layer. Oops, careful. So you see when I pulled in a gradient layer, it automatically went to the lumen range layer by accident. I need to create an empty layer first and now draw my next gradient. So on my gradient here, I'm going to use that gradient. So let's look at the mask. So it cuts off here. I am actually going to go back into Luma range and I'm going to try and avoid some of these really dark shadow areas like that. So only the red parts are now affected. Okay. And then with that done, I can then pull up my contrast, pull down my exposure a little bit. And actually what we can do is pull down our shadows. So again, remember, we've got these HDR sliders. Blacks isn't going to do much on here because actually most of this sky, as I move my mouse around, look at that orange bar up there on the histogram, it's not in the darkest parts of this image. Down here is, you can see that orange bar moving around there. But blacks, therefore, isn't going to have much of an effect, but shadows will. So shadows bringing down, highlights bringing up, whites bringing up is going to give us a bit more contrast in that. Again, I could even push contrast even more if I wanted to. Then overall, I can pull the exposure down in the sky. Remember, all of these sliders are only having an effect on this gradient with that Luma range, and the Luma range is only affecting this sort of top 2/3 of the histogram. Anything down here in the shadows is having no effect on whatsoever. That's the whole point of a Luma range and a gradient mask. So with that done, I'm sort of in a place. Let's have a look at before and after. Okay, that to me sort of works as a night shot. Again, it depends on your interpretation of it. So let's go back to our background. If anything in here, in fact, the lower Luma range, what I'm actually going to do is pull up our exposure a touch and get rid of some of this blue. So I'm going to pull down the saturation a little bit just to make it a little more rock-like. Let's just tweak the contrast a bit there. Yeah, okay. So again, it's down to interpretation, but there's our before. Looked a bit murky and green and a little bit flat, even though it's so bright. And then here is our after, which feels just a bit more like a night scene necessarily than the previous one. And the same with Miguel. If we go to our before shot, we think we've lost a lot of data. No, you haven't. It's all there. It's just a really cool night scene when it's finished. Ralph's just said hi Ralph. So Pablo's just said, is it a good idea to increase exposure a bit prior to lowering the brightness to preserve more shadows? Good question. You can tweak it a little bit. To be honest, what you're then doing, yeah, I guess you're sort of nudging a little bit, I guess. So you're sort of sliding the whole thing along here and then pushing down the rest. in theory, yes, it would have an effect of protecting the shadows, but just be careful that by doing that initial slide, you haven't pushed any highlights off the edge in that exposure one. So remember that slide of exposure, if you've got anything up here in the top highlights, maybe around the stars or whatever, although stars don't really matter if they're 255 or not. But just be careful that you haven't pushed anything off the edge before you then try and pull brightness down, because brightness may not be able to recover all of that back into the histogram. Okay, sorry, I lasted 34 minutes without a drink. That's not bad. Okay, let's go on to, where are we? Jan Erik. Nice shot, like this one. So again, lens corrections loaded in the lens profile, great. We might have some diffraction, but actually on this lens at 24, it's a pretty good lens. So I'm not worried about it too much. It's going to be sharp all the way through. I would just do that analyze on chromatic aberration just because it's habit more than anything, but it's going to give a better result than the standard manufacturer profile. And there's our beach scene, really nice. So let's see what we can do with this scene. So first off, and again, remember that the HDR tools are effectively playing with exposure, but they're only playing with certain parts of the histogram with exposure. So the way to see what the HDR is capable of doing is to use the exposure slider. It's a quick way of doing it. So to see what we can recover in those highlights, let's pull our exposure down. There's a huge amount of data in there. That's pretty good. And let's have a look at our shadows. In fact, there aren't really many shadows, but maybe in these darker areas here, well, we've got loads of data in there. But you can use the exposure slider to see the results that you'll get out of using HDR. Just quickly, Carl has just asked, so Miguel, wherever you are, where did you take the shot? Is it the really tiny text? Tramontana Mountains, by any chance? So Miguel, you need to answer. I'll put it up on the screen. So let's have a look at then, knowing what we can do with the exposure in here, let's pull down our highlights. Remember that highlights also includes those whites. So if I wanted to pull down the whites, it's only going to affect those real bright parts in here in the sun, which is great. But actually, while I'm at it, I may as well pull down all of the highlights in here because I want to get some of the color back around here that was slightly blown. Let's also pull down the whites in this case even more. So we've got a lot more detail now in that sun up here, and these rays, which are really cool. Got a couple of little dust spots there, which we need to have a look at. We can do that either with the dust spot tool. So up here under the healing brush, healing mask, you'll find in here we've got remove spot. We can do it with the healing mask, of course, but you've also got the dedicated dust spot tool. So if I just click a little circle there, it'll get rid of it with the dust spot tool. Healing mask is up here too, and that will do it just with a slightly more refined way of delivering the result. Okay, so let me just have a couple of questions up here. So Ralph, how to deal with the conflict of the cold sky and the warm city lights when shooting a cityscape during blue hour or at night? The camera will get confused. Yes, it will. Was it last week? Ralph, genuinely, have a look at the one last week. I think it was last week or the week before. I will send you a link to which one it was. We covered this because cities, absolutely, they confuse a camera. You've got yellow street lights, you've got white LEDs, you've got blue neon signs, you've got pink lights, you've got street lights reflecting, you've got car headlights and so on. The camera doesn't know what to assume for white balance. They're getting better, but they're not quite right. So effectively, what you've got to do is manually control it. And typically, I've found that the shots of a city tend to come out warmer on camera than they are in reality. So just be aware of that and maybe try and cool it down first to see if you get the right feel for the city. But remember, as you pull down the Kelvin, sometimes you end up with a slight green tint. And the reason you're getting that is because you now need to adjust the tint back up to the magenta area at the same time. You sort of use the two to offset. But yeah, cities can be a problem because of the different sources of light. So this one, number one, we did a lens correction. Number two, we've worked out what we can do, so what we can achieve with it before we even start to edit. Number three, let's just fix the straightening of the horizon because the horizon's not quite level in here. So using that straightening tool up here, the circle around the plus sign, we draw one side of the horizon to the other side, let go, and Capture One's going to straighten that up. Now that works for rotation. If it's not rotation, if you've actually got a keystone effect, we use a different tool, but for this case, then the straightening tool is the right one. Someone just said Las Vegas. Yeah, Las Vegas editing session covers extensively. Yeah, we've done quite a few about cityscape stuff, but I'll send you a link to them, Ralph, because there's quite a few that cover it. pretty well. Okay, so we've got our horizon nice and straight. From a crop point of view, I kind of like this. It sort of works as a nice tool image. We've got a little bit of stuff on here on the left. Now we've got to decide, do we want to just crop that out or do we want to heal it? Well, in this case, I don't want to lose any more information on the side because this is nice that this is kind of central up here on the top third. So rather than cropping the image, we're going to use the healing brush. So click on the healing brush up here. Whoa, that's a bit big. So we make our brush a little bit smaller. So right click anywhere on the screen when you've got a brush selected, you get the brush settings up. You can also use these square arrows or square brackets. So right square bracket makes it bigger, left square bracket makes it smaller, but that's effectively using this slider here. On a healing brush, you want to go to 100% most of the time. There are some times where you wouldn't want it 100%, but typically you're healing something, you want to get rid of it. Doesn't make sense to get rid of 80%. And in this case, on the new healing brush, I'm just going to click on what I want to get rid of. You can see there on the left-hand side, just there above where my brush is, it's added the heal layer 1. That's because I didn't have a healing layer already put into this image, so it's decided to create one for me, which is great. And it's going to decide where to pull that layer from. Now, in this case, I don't agree with Capture One. I think it should come from probably this area here and blend it in, which is much better. But Capture One will try and work out the best place to take it from, and we've seen some real amazing examples recently of people using it and having a really good result. Okay, so that's that gone, nice and clean. We've got a nice straight horizon. We've corrected for our highlights that are in here. I don't really want to mess with this too much, other than just bringing the viewer's the viewer's viewpoint to the key parts of the image. One being this sun here, and two being this bit of weed, I guess. We might want to play with this leading out to sea. So let's deal with the sea one first. I'm going to create a new layer, and we're going to call it leading line. You can guess what we're going to do here. So selected a brush on my new layer, and I'm going to make the size a little bit bigger, my opacity quite low because I'm going to add a few strokes over it. And we're just going to draw in here. I'll turn the mask on with the M key so you can all see. So I'm drawing over this path quite a few times. Really want that nice and strong. And then I'm going to blend it out slowly as we get out to these waves. I don't want it to stop abruptly. And likewise into here. You're going to see this is blended quite neatly by the time we're finished. So every single time I add a new brush stroke, it's adding 18. It's not quite 18%. It's a percentage of the remainder that's there. There's a calculation that we did on one of the YouTube videos that you can try and do if you want to really screw your head up with maths. So we've got that there. If I hold down the Alt key or the Option key and press M, I get a grayscale mask, so I can see more accurately the layers that I've built up. Make sure that it's feeling right. Okay, that's pretty good. Then let's go on to our panel on here on the left, and we're going to pull up clarity. So look at the difference that's going to make. That's 100%. That's 0. So we wash it out at 0. We make it more clear, make more contrast in the areas in clarity if we put it up to 100. To me, we're probably going to go to about 50. And all that's doing is it's just giving us a little bit of a bump to this particular part that sort of leads out to sea. Then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this one Sky. So to rename a layer, just double click on it and type in whatever you want. And as you can imagine, we're going to use the gradient layer over the sky. Now, this is all freeform at the moment. If I hold down the Shift key, that forces Capture One to go into 45-degree increments, which gives me a lot more control. Okay. From there, let's pull down our exposure a little bit, just to darken that very, very top part of the sky down, bring the viewer back down into that sunset. And I'm also going to offset the tint a little bit, just up to there, just to give it a bit more pink, a little bit more color into it rather than the greeny blue that was there under the clouds in the shadows. Then we're going to do the similar sort of thing down here. So a new layer, I'm going to call this one foreground. And in this one, I'm going to create a radial layer. So it's still a graduated layer. It's still a one that falls off from light to dark. But instead of being a layer that's on a basis of a linear gradient, it's on the basis of a radial gradient. So we're going to go to my foreground layer and draw a radial gradient around here. I could do this with vignetting. The problem with vignetting is in Capture One, the vignette is fixed in the middle of the crop. So you can have it adjust with the crop, but it's elliptical around the center of the image. This is obviously off-centered, so I don't want to do that. If I bring this circle in the middle in, it makes this transition really soft from 100% down to 0. Let's pull that down to there. Okay, so I'm going to turn my mask off so I can see what we're doing. And then with the rest of that, I'm going to pull down probably brightness rather than exposure, and just to about there. I can move this down a little bit as well. Okay, that would be it for me. I might want to tweak potentially the background just to be a bit more towards the magenta in the tint. But again, if I go to before and after, to be honest, it's a really nice shot to start with. All we've done is we've just shored it up a little bit, made it a bit more punchy, a bit more contrasty, just to give it a bit more punch. Now, if we look at this histogram, you've still got not a lot in the full deep shadows, not a lot in the big highlights. We could do one final little pop with the curve. I'd do it in the luma area on this because we've got some very different colors. If I go to the RGB, you see some very strange variants in there of what's happening with the red, green, and blue channels. So if we do that together, it's going to be a bit weird. So we do it based on brightness, which effectively is our luma curve. And I'm going to make the brighter areas brighter and the darker areas darker, but without pushing anything on this top part, the 255 area, off the edge. So we're not stretching this top part here of the curve. We're only pulling down our shadows here and up the sort of mid to highlights, or the midtones to the highlights here, with that subtle little S curve. Now, what you'll have is the effect with the Luma mask of effectively desaturating it a little bit. If we'd done it with RGB, you'd actually end up with potentially more saturation. To my mind, it's easier controlling it with the Luma curve and then just bringing some of that saturation back. So that's then now going to feel more dramatic as a shot. So effectively, we've popped the contrast a lot more, and we've ended up with a more dramatic shot. And again, this is then down to how you interpret it. If you want it to feel more light and fluffy and airy, then don't add contrast. Contrast, whether it's done through curves or whether it's done through the contrast tool, you're going to end up with a deeper, stronger, more punchy image. But to me, that kind of works. If anything in here, I could pull up our brightness a touch there. That to me feels like a really nice print. There's nothing wrong with the one to start with in the first place, but that's sort of where we get to. Okay, some questions. Where are we? So I cropped an image, then tried to use the healing brush to fix something, and the healing brush took a sample from outside the cropped area. Yes, you couldn't see the source. Yeah, it can do that. So what you have to do effectively is undo, at the moment, I think, undo the crop, or go back into your crop tool so you can see the areas outside and pull it back in. I'm pretty sure it's something that will be looked at and fixed, but yeah, I'm aware of it. What I would say as a general rule, because of the risk of that right now, is maybe do your healing first. So if you've got obvious heals to do, then maybe do them first and then do the crop a little bit later, just for now. I'm sure it's something that from a usability point of view, we'll get to a bit better. Maduro's, does the layer order matter in Capture One if you have a healing layer below adjustments or above? No, it doesn't differ. So from a healing layer's point of view, it's going to take the source and then bring it into the destination regardless, and then it's going to apply other layers on the top. So effectively, if for instance you had a crazy white balance on one side and a crazy white balance on the other side and you did a heal across, well, the heal is irrelevant to that white balance. It's going to do the heal and then it's going to apply those white balances over the top. Or it'll do the white balances first and then do the heal, but the heal is still going to accommodate for the white balance that you've got in the destination area, regardless of the source. Okay, what else we got? David, since I couldn't grab the source to reposition, I had to start. Oh, sorry, yes, I had to start over. I don't know if there's a way of stopping it right now, David, but I'm sure it's on the list. But genuinely, go to support.capture1.com, log it in, get your voice heard as well as everyone else's on any of these sort of things, and get it going. It's Jan Eric. Okay, cool. So that's your picture. Cool. Right. Oh, whoa. So I know where this is. This is it called Nord Fruberg or something lighthouse. It's in Denmark, in Aalborg. It's a very famous lighthouse because it was eroding into the sea. Basically, the sand is eroding away all the time, and pretty soon, it won't be there. Or I think they're going to move it or something. They're actually going to pick the thing up and move it inland. Anyway, very cool picture. Apart from the fact that it's obviously captured the mood quite accurately in that you seem to be in some sort of sandstorm, which, having been there, I know it's not particularly comfortable when you are. Again, 50mm, there's probably not much distortion, so Capture One said, leave it at 0, that's fine, that's correct for this lens. We'll do our chromatic aberration on there. f5.6, we're not going to worry too much about diffraction. So I'm going to leave the lens profile there once we've done that. Now, let's look at our histogram on this. So the reason that we don't have a huge amount of contrast in here is because all of our histogram is bunched up. It's gone, here's the histogram from 0 to 255, and it's bunched it all up in there. Um, so what we can do is we can stretch it. We can stretch that histogram out. And it depends on what you want this to feel like. So if you want it to feel like we're lost in a sandstorm, then the last thing we want to add is more contrast. But if you want to see some of the details, then maybe we want to pull that out. So first things first, before we do anything around white balance, let's see what detail we can get. So it has, there we go, correction, it has been moved, yeah. There's a lot of fog in this, yeah, I agree. So, same with mist, same with fog, same with sand, same with whatever. You can get this in, if you're shooting Dubai, for example, during one of their storms, you can get this, you get it in, I think a couple of sessions ago we did one with a tree and some mist and so on. It's all about clarity. It's clarity, clarity, clarity. And unfortunately, bear in mind, there is a limit. If the camera didn't see the detail, then you can't just magic up the detail. But if it did, we can probably bring it back. So, and again, this comes down to if you want to. If you like the picture like this, then leave it as it is. If that reflects the right mood, then leave it as it is. But we can probably tweak it to make it a little clearer, a little more comfortable to see. First thing to try is clarity. Well, yep, that boosts it, so there's our lighthouse back a little bit clearer. But I think we can probably do a bit better than that. So again, if we go to our levels, so remember, levels is a way of stretching out that histogram. So these are my inputs, or input levels down here, and my outputs along here. So effectively, if I drag this along, I'm telling Capture One, instead of making 0 black, make 0 black. And in fact, I want you to make 64, which is maybe dark gray, black. So I'm stretching it from dark gray up to black. So in other words, my histogram has become not this full distance here from 0 to 255, but this mini distance from 64 to 255, and treat 64 as if it was 0, and treat 255 as if it was 255. Well, of course, I can go tighter than that, so I can say, well, actually, let's not do it as 255. I want the brightest parts of the image to be at 227. And I want the darkest parts of the image to be all the way up here at 130, because there was no data for all of this histogram. Now, regardless of what the output is, your levels histogram will always retain its original settings. You can always see where the histogram originally sat. But what you can now see is by doing that, we've stretched that entire histogram to cover the whole range from 0 all the way up to 255 and everything in between. And everything just becomes clearer because we've taken the data that was in this small subsection of the histogram and we've stretched it right the way out. So then we've got some decisions to make, because do I really want this sand being quite that dark and deep and contrasty? Maybe not. So let's maybe pull that back a little bit there, but maybe we pull the mid-tones in to there so I can see the lighthouse a bit better. That would work. Of course, we can play with our curves. Let's just reset that curve there. So I can change our RGB curve. Now, if you look at these curves or these histogram representations of the red, green, and blue channel, you can see there's a huge difference in red, green, and blue in this picture, and we can also see it there. So we've got areas of the picture where there's only blue, where there's only green, where there's only red in terms of their values in brightness from 0 to 255. So instead of doing it on the RGB channel, we need to do this on Luma. So it affects effectively the brightness evenly rather than based on where the colors lie. And with our Luma range, or Luma channel, sorry, we're going to just pull that up and pull that one down. So again, we're adding more contrast. Anytime we see an S curve in a curve, we're darkening the shadows and we're brightening the highlights. We're adding contrast effectively. And then with all that done, then let's use clarity. And that's going to make the lighthouse now stand out a lot clearer than it did before. We could use structure. Now what structure, remember, is going to do is going to play with some of the sand elements of this and the texture in this brickwork. Let me do it to a maximum so you can see there, way too much. Don't ever do structure to that level. But you can see what it's doing. It's attaching to all the texture and all the detail and all the rough stuff in the image, and it's pulling it out to be a bit clearer. So let's pull it down to somewhere between 20 and 30, no more than that. Okay, so then you've got a scenario, and you notice we haven't added any layers on this because there's really no point to my mind. If I add a gradient layer down here, well, I'm going to lose some of the lighthouse in that gradient as well. We actually have a bit of vignetting on here, so what I'm going to do is go back to my lens tab and go to this light fall off slider, and the light fall off will correct for the vignetting in the lens. So this is where we don't want a vignette. So it's either a wide lens or it was using a filter or something like that. We have a spot of some sort there. Nice little dust spot. So we need to fix that one. We can do that with our healing brush tool. So up here on the top, we've got a little heal brush. Again, tool's a little bit big for this image, so let's make it smaller. Make sure on your healing brush you're at 100% opacity. And we're just going to, in fact, I can do it manually, so I can say I want you to take the source point from there. So I've held down the Option key or the Alt key, clicked on the source point, click on the destination point, and it's done it pretty well, or pretty nicely there. That's pretty good. Okay. That may be where we have to leave it, because now anything I do, even let's imagine I did put a gradient up here, it's just not going to work. So if I pull this down here, what are we going to do? We're going to change the white balance? Well, no, because that's just going to look weird. We're going to change the tint? Well, again, no, that's going to look weird as well. If anything, we just have to leave it where it was with that atmosphere. And the atmosphere is right in this picture. It feels right. But let's just have a look at before and after. So whereas before, now you can see how little detail there was. So before, we're into a pretty rough state. It's very difficult to see any detail in there in the lighthouse. And then after, there it is. There's not much we can do with that sky. The sky is flat. The sky is pretty much blown out. And it's lost in the fog. It's a foggy day. Whether it's fog or sand doesn't make any difference. You're going to lose the detail. But look at how much detail there really was in that picture compared to what we originally had out of the raw of the camera. And that's what we're talking about here in Capture One. It's how to get the best out of your picture, out of the data that your camera recorded, without ruining the picture. This still feels natural. It still feels like you're there in the fog or in the sand or whatever, and it still feels murky, but it doesn't feel lost like that one. Now, ironically, we might take a picture one week in one of these sessions and make it feel more like the other one. We use negative clarity to do that, as well as reducing some contrast. But in this case, it's probably the best bet. Okay, for the sake of today, in fact, let's very quickly, we've got a couple of minutes, so we're just going to, this is actually quite a quick one anyway. So this is Frank's shot. I think that's Patagonia, Torres del Paine, I think. So let's just make sure we've got a lens profile in, which we do. Let's show you how quickly we can do this now. I'm going to draw a very quick gradient over our sky and our mountain down here, and just hold that ready, because I'm going to go back to my background layer. I'm going to pull up some clarity in here. I'm going to certainly pull up some contrast. And I'm actually going to pull down our shadows, because I want this mountain here and this rock here to become more defined. Then going back to my sky layer, my gradient that I drew earlier, I'm going to pull the clarity up. I'm going to pull our highlights down a little bit. I'm going to pull our whites down a little bit, pull our contrast up. And I'm also going to use a little curve adjustment here, just to make that mountain really pop. Like that. So that was quick, wasn't it? Let's have a look at before and after. So again, we go from this, a little bit murky, through to this, which is a bit more impressive. Now we could go even further in that sky if I actually add a new layer on top and say sky details, and I'm going to draw a new gradient just over this part here. So it's over here, so it's on top of, remember, the existing gradient I have here. But with this gradient just in the top part of the sky, I'm going to pull the highlights and the whites down a long way more than we had before. Now, bear in mind, we've got a little dust spot up here, so we want to fix that too. Could do it with the healing tool, but just for quickness, we're going to do it with the dust spot tool and that one there. There's one there, not that bird. The bird's pretty important. So you've just seen how quickly we can get clarity back in the picture. Literally, what, 5 or 6 clicks with a couple of layers, and we go from there. Nothing wrong with it. That's the mood that was there. But here, which is a lot more impressive as a mountain range. And it's with a couple of quick clicks. So just bear in mind, if you see a picture which is lacking in contrast, like this one or like this one was originally, it's real quick to fix some of this stuff in Capture One. You just need to play with that high dynamic range with the clarity tool and then boost contrast, whether that's through levels or the contrast tool or curves. Doesn't make much of a difference, but there we go. Right, Deepak, you were asking, can the brush default to 100% flow and opacity for heal and clone? Not quite. There's been a couple of discussions about this because there's different ways of working with it. At the moment in Capture One, you've got this tool here called Link All Brushes. I have it enabled, which means if I go to my brush tool and change opacity to 46, because I've got Link All Brushes tool set, oh sorry, the brushes option set, when I go to my heal tool, it also has it set at 46. If I unclick this, Link All Brushes, And let's say I set my heal to 100%. When I go back to my brush tool, you'll see that's still at 46. It's independent, so 32 or whatever. If I go to my clone tool, that will be set at, let's say, 71. Go to my heal tool, that's still set at 100. Go to my normal brush tool, that's still set at 32. So I can have them all independent, no problem, or I can link them all at the moment. At the moment, there is no way of having the heal and clone brushes linked, but at one level, and the other brush is linked at another. Okay, so that's probably us for today. Just a couple of reminders. So upcoming, our next editing session you've got on the 13th of July, so that's next Monday. We will get to some of the other pictures we didn't get to today, but also please keep sending them in. We'll try and get to as many as we can. For those of you that didn't see it, if you want to learn about something called frame averaging or dual exposure plus, or see me play with some of my pictures for once, then have a look at the replay on YouTube from the session with Teamwork and Phase 1 that we did last Thursday. That's available on the channel. Don't forget that you've got access to all of those pro tips things, which are free, which will cover things like clarity and so on as well. In those sessions. Don't forget to join that Facebook group, which will allow you to have a chat about this. This is also where this video will store on Facebook after this session. Send us stuff through on that upload tool, and that's about it. And it's exactly 4 o'clock, which means I did it in exactly 1 hour. Well done me. Cool. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you next week. Cheers. Bye.